Well, good morning, everyone. Our number has stabilized. We've been at the same number now for a few seconds, so I'm going to say everybody's in the meeting. Welcome to the May Policy Practice Group meeting. Today's going to be a little different. Today we're going to skip the breakout intros because we're going to do our own breakout groups as we go into a discussion about some policy priority number one. So just go ahead and do your intros in the chat. So name of where you're from, what your weather is like, since that's what we were talking about. Go ahead and do that in the chat. We can have who's here and keep track of that. To prep for the breakout, so we're talking about policy priority number one, which is using policy mechanisms to mandate the use of future climate information in decision making. We'll be talking about that after the intros and round robin. So what we'd like you to do, and Megan will post it in the chat, is in front of your name. If you don't know how to change your name, you can go to the three little dots by your head and press on that and rename yourself. F is for federal, if you want to talk about federal policy mechanisms. S for state, if you're more interested in talking about state mechanisms. L for local, if we're talking about local, that's city, county, district. And then and parish. And then T for tribal, if you're interested in talking more about tribal mechanisms. So Megan's put that. You have a little while to make your decision. We're going to jump into the round robins with Anna.
Great. Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. So I've got some updates from the federal level, mostly congressional related updates. If other people have policy updates, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you want to jump in with them, just make a note in the chat and we'll make sure you can do that in just a moment. So Congress has been out of session for the last couple of weeks, but there's actually still a lot of things going on that might be of interest to this group. So one of them is that the appropriations process for fiscal year 2023 is now underway. For people who don't have the pleasure of being familiar with the congressional appropriations process, basically there's 12 subcommittees of the appropriations subcommittees in the House and the Senate, and they all cover different federal agencies, different federal programs, and they basically go through a process of figuring out how much money they're going to give to each of the programs each year. That's the part of the process we're at right now. And any group can do person can do outside witness testimony and submit that to the subcommittee relevant to the program that you're interested in. So I just flagged that in case that's of interest to anybody. Deadlines are, I can drop in the chat. So deadlines for House outside witness testimony can all be found at this website. And then ones for the Senate are a little bit more complicated. You have to go to each subcommittee's website and then click on the PDF at the bottom of the page. And then at the bottom of that, you'll see each deadline. Every single subcommittee, so all 24 of them, get to set their own deadlines, and they're all different. So you have to kind of watch that. And they all get posted at different times as well, but most of them are posted at this point. And the next closest one is May 13th, and they kind of run through the month of May and June. So if that's of interest to kind of let Congress know the programs related to adaptation and resilience that are important to you, now's the window to do that. Kind of along a similar line, there's more and more requests for input coming out from Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, for input on how they're going to implement programs funded by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So that's something to kind of like watch the federal registry for and see if there's programs that are being developed related to adaptation and resilience that you might want to give input on. And we might even generate some ideas today that would be, in our group breakout rooms that could be relevant to share in some of these requests for information. So that's also something, process that's underway that would be good for, or maybe of interest to keep an eye on. The other thing that's happening right now is that the House Agriculture Committee is starting to hold lots and lots of hearings on the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill will be actually written probably starting with the new Congress in January. If anyone else has other differing information on that, let me know. But for now, especially the House committee is spending a lot of time doing hearings, trying to get stuff on the record, especially as it relates to climate. my organization's been tracking all these, and I can drop this in the chat. We are doing just like little bullet summaries of key points related to climate, energy, and environment from every Farm Bill hearing. So if that's useful to anyone, feel free to use it. Just drop that in the chat. Just after we had this meeting last month, the House passed the Resilient America Act. That happened on April 5th. So that's now with the Senate. And I'm going to drop in the chat the summary of that bill from congress.gov. So that may also be of interest. And then just a couple more things to flag. This has been kind of, for Congress being out of session, there's a lot going on. There is a new bill from an Arizona representative on dealing with urban heat and having an urban heat mitigation grant program. So that is of interest. And then there have been a couple hearings over the last month that may also be of interest. One on investing in wildfire management, ecosystem restoration, and resilient communities, examining implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law that was held by the Committee on Natural Resources in the House side. There was also a hearing by the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure on the House side on FEMA priorities for 2022 and through 2026. And then there was a House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, so House side, hearing on America's natural solutions, the climate benefits of investing in healthy ecosystems. And so those all are pretty relevant to different pieces of what people in this group work on as well. So that's kind of what I tracked down for things happening on the Hill right now. If anybody else would like to jump in with any updates, now is the moment. Go ahead, Rod.
Sorry, I got to get my mute off. I always forget that. I got to close the door here. Hang on. Yes, just real quick on the Storm Act state level implementations. We have been successful in Maryland and Virginia to get their bills passed. There's a little hiccup in the Virginia, but they've got it worked out. Governor's going to sign it. Maryland just goes into effect if it doesn't get signed. It's automatic. We are deep in the throes of last 4 weeks of session in New York with a bill introduced in the House and the Senate. We were working with lots of support from New York counties and emergency managers and all sorts of stuff to get that done and passed within 3 weeks. And then, surprise to me, New Orleans came to the table and swung hard and introduced their own revolving loan program in my own home state, which we weren't even working with. And I got to testify a week ago in the committee hearing, passed unanimous through the House, and is scheduled for Senate committee hearing next week. Again, trying to make that last 3 weeks of the session deadline in order to be eligible for the first FEMA capitalization grants for the Storm Act coming out next year when FEMA gets their program rolling. So pretty exciting.
Thanks, Rod. John, did you want to mention anything about WRDA?
I put an update in the chat. I mean, it's going to pass by the end of June, which keeps it on the biennial cycle for authorization. I think the one thing that jumped out is they're going to start a STEM program for underrepresented communities, is the way they've worded it, to develop a STEM workforce in the next generation in green collar jobs. I think that's kind of cool to see in there. And of course, huge prioritization of resiliency of water infrastructure. So this is the Army Corps infrastructure. So dams, levees, waterways, inland waterways, more work on making sure they're keeping up on the dredging of waterways that are near and important to, how'd they put it? Underserved communities, harbors, and inland waterways. So kind of a reemphasis on that, and then a reformulation of how they do the Inland Waterway Trust Fund. But yeah, so it's on track, and a lot of climate resilience and resiliency in there.
Awesome. Thanks, John.
And it's Senate Bill 4137.
Awesome. Great. And thank you to the couple other people that dropped things in the chat, Joel, Angie. check those links out if you haven't seen them yet. Okay, great. John, I can pass it back to you, but I think I'm on the next thing. So if you want me to just keep rolling, I can do that too.
You can pass it back, but I'll pass it right back to you.
Okay. All right. So the next thing we want to give an update on is the policy tracker. So thank you everyone who joined the meeting last month for giving us your input via the survey. We had a couple meetings to discuss our plan going forward. And I'm really excited that Sophia is here with us today. She has volunteered to kind of keep the tracker updated over the next year, which is amazing because it's a lot of work. So Sophia, I wanted to pass it over to you to share a little bit with the group about your plans, what's going to be included, what's not included, and how people can best get the most out of the tracker. So pass it over to you.
Only correct me if I'm misspeaking. So hi, everyone. My name is Sophia. I'm about to graduate with a PhD in chemical engineering at Columbia, where I studied materials for carbon capture. I'm also a mentee of the ASAP mentorship program. So volunteering to keep track of the policy tracker. And last week, Brianna and Anna and I revamped the policy tracker to make it more streamlined. I usually update it weekly with updates from these monthly meetings and whatever updates that come up in the Slack. So last month, the survey showed that lots of people are interested in federal and state policy. And when I was going through the policy tracker, I noticed that most of the policies we're tracking so far are on the federal level. So I really encourage anyone to share more state and local policies and tribal policies, either here in the meeting or on Slack. I'll populate it in the policy tracker. We decided to focus more on on legislation and also any important like executive orders anyway, I welcome any feedback, and I'm just getting my feet wet in policy. You can shoot me a message on Slack or email me with an email I'll put in the chat. Thanks. But Anna, you can correct me if I missed anything.
No, that's perfect. Thank you, Sophia. And we're all super appreciative of the time you're putting into making this happen. And I guess the one last thing I'll mention is if people use other trackers to kind of track state, local, or federal policy that's relevant to adaptation, we thought we might make another tab on the tracker where we just list those so that people have those additional resources they might want to look to. So if there are any of those you use, feel free to drop those in the chat or email Sophia or myself, and we will make sure we add those as kind of an additional way to find more resources. And I think with that, I will pass it back to you, John.
Great. Thank you, Sophia, for taking that on. That's a nice update. Okay, I'm hoping by now everybody has put their local, state, federal, kind of double check, make sure everybody's picked a room to go into. So basically this is policy priority number 1. So ASAP has policy priorities, and this is priority number 1. Last month we had someone talking about using climate data for policy. We had a few speakers. Next month, Laura will be kicking off the equity policy priority. So if you don't know what the policy priorities, we can put the link up in the chat and you can review that document. It's in the agenda as well. So when we talk about mechanisms, we're basically talking about ways for people to implement policy or practices. So when we're thinking about what level of government, and this is U.S. government, I don't think, I'm trying to see who we have on the call, but what mechanisms, what things can be done to how people leverage climate science data for making local decisions or making decisions at a state or federal level. And what we'd like to do is actually, forgot about that, talk about developing an action plan. What can we do as a policy priority group at ASAP? We have a lot of requests to do, we support policies, or we support some federal legislation, and we're asked to do that a lot. And we write quick updates, and you'll see them in the chat, you'll see them in Slack. where people are asking ASAP to support or comment on policies. And what we want to do is start getting a little bit more organized around how would we, where are the policies we're looking for? What policies do we want to see done? At what level do we want these policies? So if we think about state and federal, we have lots of members who could work at the state and local level. Obviously, ASAP does pretty good at working at the federal level. We have a lot of people that track federal legislation, but also thinking about ways to help others do things at their state level or the local level. So as we do these policy priorities, and as we have this discussion this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are, think about it in terms of what would you want ASAP and the policy practice group to focus on, and what kind of actions do you see as important. We're going to take about 20 minutes in a breakout room. We've got some prompts for the facilitators, and there's facilitators assigned to each of the breakouts. And if there's more than 8 people, we're going to probably break the group up. So we just have 8 people in each group, 8 or less, with a facilitator and then someone wanting to take notes. Make sure I cover everything. And then I think if everybody's got their letter, and it looks like Rod and Amy need to pick a letter. Did I miss anything, Anna, on the action plan that we talked about a month ago?
I don't think so, but maybe I would tap Rachel to see if there's anything else.
I feel like I'm forgetting to say something. I'm not sure what it is. If I knew what it was, I wouldn't forget to say it.
Do we want to give one last plug for the NCARS support for folks, if folks want to sign on to that?
Sure.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's mostly a question for Anna, but.
Do you want me to, or go ahead? I'm happy for you to do it.
I wasn't sure if you're asking if we need more framing on the action plan or if there was anything we missed in the updates.
I was technically asking about the framing of the action plan, but I'm always happy to plug NCARS.
Okay. Well, we'll plug NCARS in the chat. And I guess the only other framing on the action plan that I'll give is I think that it's really an opportunity for us to bring our policy priorities to life. And so that is like the main message that I would leave folks with as we're thinking about what we want to put there. Like everything that we put out in ASAP, we often put out big ideas, and everyone always wants more specific information. And so this is a process that we've created to really generate that information, to get it from people's heads out onto paper in a way that's like at least effort for the folks that are in the room. So let's do it. Like basically, let's use this time to really get all of those ideas from your heads to the paper. Right.
And one of the things too is to start being more proactive on policy instead of reactive, right? So a lot of times we're just reacting to what other people are coming up with. So is there an opportunity for ASAP to be more proactive on the policies we want to push based on these policy priorities? Anyway, I think it's time to go to our breakout rooms. Let's make sure we have a lot of time to have discussion. We set aside 20 minutes to have discussion, then we'll come back for another 20 minutes and kind of share and see how the cross-sector talk went. And then kind of as a timeline, a few of us will probably sit down and we'll put a call out for volunteers, but probably a few of us sit down and write, okay, for policy priority number 1, what's our action plan? What are the things that stood out from this discussion that we got to start looking at? Anyway, with that, Megan, I think we could go to breakout. I will fill the dead air while I look at the notes. I am going to pick on the facilitators first. Anyway, I just wanted to look at what people had written and who wrote the most. So Joel and Anna, do you want to, let's start at the federal level. Joel and Anna, do you have any big revelations out of your groups?
So Anna, do you want to go first? We were actually in different groups. I think we had so many people.
You had 2 different groups? Good. Okay.
Yeah. Great. I don't know. Anna, do you want to go first or do you want me to go?
Sure. I can jump in.
Sure.
So and I think I put my notes in the wrong place, so I will move them to wherever they're supposed to be. I did take notes. Okay. So we talked about the need to include climate information and future climate data in the NEPA process, and that it was there, but then got taken out. And there is a need for figuring out how it can be included and kind of safeguarded once it is included, so it can't be taken out again when there's different political wins, not wins. So that was one really interesting one that got brought up. We also talked about flood insurance and the NFIP and risk rating 2.0 and what is that going to look like and how effectively is that including future climate data, and what that means for people's rates. And then we talked a lot about Atlas 14. One person in our group's working on research on that, and we shared a lot of really useful resources on Atlas 14. And one piece of the conversation there is, okay, maybe maybe in every instance we can't use future climate data, but can we at least use current instead of 2 or 3 decades old climate data? So that was another piece of our conversation. And then we kind of wrapped up by talking about what do we think are some of the barriers to including future climate data? Is it that it's not available? Is it a political thing? Is it a question of accessibility and ability to interpret it? Is it a capacity issue to collect it on the ground? So kind of discuss those points. So that is what our group is up to. If anyone in my group thinks I missed anything or miscategorized anything, feel free to drop that in the chat. But I think over to you, Joel.
All right. Thanks, Anna. So our group was took a little different approach, even though we're dealing with the feds. We looked more broadly at what is the appropriate federal role in providing information. And one of the questions is whether it should be mandated, should it be across the government or sector specific. I think the sense was first that we're not at a point to mandate the use of information. It doesn't, I think part of the problem is it's not clear what we want. It's not clear the Fed knows what is want. In fact, it was pointed out that there's real problems with where the information is. There's all these different data sets. It's not standardized. It's hard to know where to go. So the Fed in many ways needs to be better. The federal government needs to be better organized and make it clear to people how, where the information is, how to use it. But they also need to think through how the information is used, maybe think that through at a sector scale, that is, for maybe coastal uses, agriculture, economic development. I made one, suggestion that individual agencies might build, information, at least making information available into their programs. And for example, the Economic Development Administration was mentioned as example. But whatever's done, we need to make sure that it's clear and a streamlined approach. And, ASAP could help in terms of facilitating discussion among stakeholders, but also maybe help the federal government think through a process for, how to organize and provide information to be supportive of decision making. But the sense was it didn't seem to make sense to mandate that the information be used, at least not yet, but get the information better organized so it can be fulfill the needs of different stakeholders. Anybody want to add anything? Anyone from the group that I miss or misinterpreted? They're all too kind. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Anna and Joel in your groups. So the state level, I'm gonna go first.
Okay. Thanks, John.
She had a more interesting discussion. We had 2 polar opposite discussions, if I look at the notes correctly.
Yeah, so in my group, we talked a lot about some of the lack of teeth and requirements at the state level for integrating projections, just that could be hard to get states beyond just saying you have to consider climate change in your projects, let alone consider, what the climate might be like in 2050 or what have you. But I think where we ended up having a really interesting discussion was about maybe different sorts of economic incentives that could be used, and also some of the challenges that might come in when you're trying to get down to the local level, where there can be some disconnect between what the state might want and what the local government has the actual capacity to do, especially when it comes to designing infrastructure. And we talked about perhaps trying to increase the use of green infrastructure or using that as a mechanism to incentivize governments. And yeah, if there's anything that I'm missing, people from my group, please feel free to chime in.
Thanks, Emma. So my group was a state level group, but I think it was interesting because I think we had enough people from states where nothing's being done on climate resiliency at the state level, where it's like, how would you actually get things going? What came out of it, and probably something we should take away and think about, is framework and guidelines for people to use to start having these discussions at the state level. I mean, here I was thinking the state level, we'd have all these discussions about permitting and permits. A lot of statewide permits tend to have people trigger, you need a state permit for a lot of different things. And permits are always a great mechanism to get policy out, because you can be a little bit more flexible with permits than actually writing policy, right? A permit writer or a permittee has to be able to meet certain standards, whether that's like a national pollution discharge elimination NPDES permit, the NIPSES permit, where I've seen a lot of climate policy actually be implemented at the state level through those permits. Having industries look at the amount of nitrogen, having the industries look at how to incorporate sea level rise into facility planning, things like that. But that is not what happened in our group. Our group basically said, gee, there's all these states that aren't doing anything, or are actually going backwards and eliminating some of the things about climate change in statewide, say, building code standards, or just not having the discussion at all. And then Dave Nelson brought up, like, people just don't know what needs to be done. They don't know what they should know, and they don't know enough of what they don't know. And that's what I took out of it. But something we should really think about at the state level is having this idea, this guideline for policy to be implemented at the state level. And I'm really curious to hear about the local level, because that's where a lot of action can happen. But at the same time, it's not uniform, right? We at the state level, we were thinking about comparing Maine to Florida, even though Florida is a quote unquote red state. They do a lot of climate resiliency work in Florida. It even passed a lot of policies on climate resiliency, but Maine has done very little on climate policy, where climate policy is impacting some of their bigger industries, like the lobster fishermen. So it's in the notes. And Emma, thank you. So I'm going to pass it over to the locals, which is Dave and Gavin.
Yeah, so there were 4 of us in the group here, and we had I think a really robust discussion. To your point, John, Megan made a very similar point as far as getting everyone kind of needing access to the same data and doing this, kind of taking that same similar approach. There does seem to be a variety of ways in which we go about gathering and using this information. We got some really good insight from Laura as far as what's happening in King County and Seattle. And it sounds like some really wonderful things are happening as far as access to data and the ability to get information and get the necessary, data sets required to do the analysis, to understand what the risks are and understand what needs to potentially be done. Specifically speaking about some stormwater facility design measures that can be done. I think the biggest hangup here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, is more about what's the appropriate methodology. What's the best practices in that regard when we're using this climate data and have access to all this information? What's the best way to use it and have it appropriately used for making decisions in that regard? And I think, being in Houston, we're the complete opposite as far as mandating anything. You bring up the word mandate and you could end up being exiled out of the state. So we very much have access to a lot of information. We've actually created a variety of different data sets, working with university partners and working with NOAA and working with Sea Grant and a variety of folks. But getting people to actually look and use that information, there's no expectation of that being mandated or required in any way, shape, or form. But I think one other thing, Laura, you mentioned, and I just went, oh, shoot. Laura, did I cover everything you covered? There's one thing I've thought we had mentioned, and
Yeah, no, I mean, I just think at the local level, it's as long as you have the political will, and then it's really easy to essentially require the use of climate information in decision making. It's a policy statement, right? It's a decision by a director, an executive. We're going to do this. The point we were talking about is that that's one thing, but the hard part is actually knowing what to do with the information when you do it. So it's the work of actually incorporating that information is a far bigger job. But in terms of just having that policy in place, that's easy. Then the other question is whether, like as you look at a state level and how that influences work at the local level, should there be a standardized set of scenarios, for example, that everybody's required to use? And so in California, they had a state level, like a state endorsed set of sea level rise scenarios. Is that the approach that should be taken once you start, if you want to require the use of climate information, or should it still be left to local governments to determine what are the right data sources?
So I'm going to cut you off really quick because we need to get to the tribes and we only have a few minutes left. We'd love to talk all day about how great King County is, but Angie, do you want to give us a really brief outline on tribes? Sorry, we're running low on time, and so people are starting to check out. And feel free to leave at 11. Thank you for attending today, and then we'll just hear from Angie, and then probably cut it off from there because I think a number of people need to jump off the call on the hour. So.
Yeah. Well, okay. So we in the tribal group right away sort of dove in on whether or not this question is really the appropriate questions for tribes. Tribes could conceivably require themselves to use climate information. I haven't seen it done a whole lot, but others maybe shouldn't. And so the different question might be for the policy environment for federal and state, or even local governments. What could policy do to help tribes with climate information? But then the other conversation that came up was like, to what extent do tribes need more information? Do they know what they need to know using their own traditional ecological knowledges? Do they know more than others? So it was an interesting conversation about where do you really put the emphasis? Do we want to help them understand, help them with information, help them understand their vulnerability, so that I think all of us are just trying to make sure that the investments are targeted to the right, most, the biggest problems, especially in under-resourced communities. Or do we want to just really focus on making sure that they have the access they need to information that helps them do the adaptation itself, just move to action, help them do the things they know they need to do? And what would that kind of information look like? We talked about the potential for technical assistance and planning and design help.
Perfect. Thank you, Angie. And it's the top of the hour, so if you need to jump off, please do so. And we will start up again next month with Laura having a set of speakers. I know there's a good set of speakers coming in to talk about the equity policy priority. And then we'll keep updating you on where we're going with the action plan. So thanks everyone for joining today, and have a great weekend.